Hi everybody, in this video we're going to consider whether improvements in the terms of trade are always good for a nation and whether deteriorations in the terms of trade are always bad for a nation. The two words imply improvements always good, deteriorations always bad. When it comes to the end of this video you're going to realise that actually it depends. Improvements and deteriorations, whether they're good or bad, depend on some of these important factors at the end. And what you realise is that the terms of trade, although useful to some extent, misses out some really key bits of information that help us determine whether improvements and deteriorations are good or bad. So there's a reminder of the equation for you there. Let's take some examples of improvements in the terms of trade. So let's say, as I mentioned in my previous video, that maybe demand for exports for a given nation has increased. That's led to an increase in the price of exports. That's led to an improvement in the terms of trade. As the terms of trade improves, the equation, the theory suggests that the quantity levels of export will remain exactly the same. That's quite a large assumption. Therefore, as a result of that assumption, as a result of an improvement, a country, through the export of a price of a given basket of goods and services, can actually buy in more imports than they could have done before. That's the assumption that the theory makes. Now, that theory only holds if an improvement in the terms of trade translates into higher export revenues. Only then can a nation actually buy in more imports than before. Only then is the purchasing power of a nation increasing. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for an increase in revenues, for an improvement in the terms of trade to actually be beneficial. The theory implies that's always going to happen because quantity levels will stay the same, but we need to dissect and see whether that always happens or not. So let's take an increase in the demand for exports. Okay, maybe that's a change in fashion and tastes which favours the exports of the given nation. I've made up a little diagram here where on the x-axis I've got the average export price for a nation, and on the x-axis I've got the quantity of exports for a given nation. We've got supply and demand here. So we're saying that demand for these exports have actually risen because of a change in fashion and taste towards these exports, which shifts demand to the right for exports from D1 to D2. And there is the increase in price. Alright? So the increase in price there will lead to the top part of the equation going up in value, which will lead to an improvement in the terms of trade, assuming that nothing happens to imports and import prices. Now, what we need to see is an increase in revenue for this improvement in the terms of trade to translate into real benefits for the nation. Now, can this be seen on the diagram? Well, yes, it can. Initially, revenue was this green box, price times quantity. Whereas now, because of this increase in demand, because quantity's increased and there is a higher price, overall the revenue's increased to now, let's do it in red, to now this big red box here. Okay, so revenues, you can see export revenues have increased. So in that sense, whenever demand increases for exports, which leads to an increase in the price of exports, and then an improvement in the terms of trade, we can be quite decisive and say, well, actually that is always a good thing for a nation because it translates into higher export revenues. That's fine. But let's take something more uncertain. Let's take something like high relative inflation rates. So if a country has got high relative inflation, then according to the terms of trade equation, that will lead to an improvement in the terms of trade because export prices will increase. But is that always going to be a good thing? Well, what we need to understand is whether that translates into higher export revenues, whether the higher export prices translate to higher export revenues, and what's going to happen to quantity, right? So these two fundamental factors are important. To understand whether this is going to be good or bad for a nation, we need to know more information. We need to understand what's happening to the elasticity of demand for exports. That's the most important thing. Now, if you watch my video on the Marshall-Lerner condition and the J-curve effect, you'll understand this concept to a T. It might be worth watching that video if you don't really get this idea. But very simply, we're assuming that export prices are going up. This is a good thing in terms of improving the terms of trade position for a nation. But for higher export revenues to be generated, we need demand for exports to be very price inelastic. If there is a product that is quite price inelastic, then as the price of it goes up, revenue generated from selling that product will also go up. So in that sense, if there is higher relative inflation translating to higher export prices, if demand for exports is very price inelastic, then yes, export revenues will go up. Okay, so we can say, look, if demand for exports is inelastic, okay, price inelastic, then yes, that's going to be a good thing when there are high relative inflation rates pushing up export prices. Then it's okay. Then that is a good thing. But if demand for exports is elastic, so if export demand is elastic, then if you push up the price of it, revenues generated is actually going to fall. In that sense, that's not a good thing. And this is where the terms of trade breaks down. It assumes that as soon as export prices go up, quantity levels being sold to the rest of the world will stay the same. Because they are the same and you're exporting something at a higher price, your revenues will increase, it's going to be good. You can buy more imports. That's quite a large assumption to make. In reality, that might not be true. We need to know more about quantities, we need to know more about elasticity for that kind of conclusion to be reached, for that to be a good thing. So, improvements in the terms of trade, if caused by an increase in demand for exports, we can say is always going to be a good thing, because revenues will increase. But if it's something like an increase in relative inflation rates, what we need to understand more is the elasticity of demand. That's the most important determining factor as to whether the improvement will translate into higher export revenues. Right, what about deteriorations? Well, for the same reasons really, deteriorations in the terms of trade does not always imply that it's going to be a bad thing for a nation. Let's say a nation has improved its productivity or has improved the technology available in that country, then that will lead to a country being more internationally competitive. So even though that might translate to lower export prices, it may lead to greater quantities of exports being sold, which may translate into higher overall export revenues being generated, which may lead to an improvement in a country's economic situation as a result. So deterioration is not always bad, it depends on what's causing it. So those kind of competitiveness factors that are leading to a worsening of the terms of trade might not be a bad thing at all for a nation, might be very good. But for developing countries, a deterioration in the terms of trade might come back to incomes. I hinted at this in my previous video. But to understand how that might be very bad for a developing nation, watch my video on the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. I'll put a link right here for you to watch it. Watch that video and you'll understand how a deterioration there can actually be a very bad thing, because it links back to the kinds of goods that are being sold in developing countries, to the kinds of goods that are being imported by developing countries, and to the patterns of incomes in the globalized world economy. So basically, the final conclusion is improvements are not always good. They might be bad. Deteriorations are not always bad. They might be good. Depends on what's causing them. Depends on the quantities of exports and imports being sold and being bought in. And crucially, it depends on the PED of exports and imports in determining the final impact on export revenues and import expenditures, and therefore determining the effect on the current account position and then the final effect on aggregate demand in the economy. So the terms of trade ignores these factors, ignores that, oh, a deterioration might actually be as a result of a country being more internationally competitive. The terms of trade ignores that and says, well actually no, your terms of trade is going to worsen, you're not going to be able to buy in as many imports as before, it's not a good thing for an economy. So it ignores that, which actually might lead to more benefits for an economy. It ignores these quantity impacts, which are really important, and ignores the PED. So in your mind, revenues and import expenditures are more important to calculate than just looking at whether the terms of trade have improved or deteriorated. And it's no good just saying that every time a terms of trade position deteriorates, that means that a country is going to suffer because it can buy in less import. Not necessarily. And same for an improvement. Just because a country has an improved terms of trade, it doesn't mean that they're always going to be able to bring in and buy in more imports. We need to make a link to revenues, we need to make a link to import expenditures before we make these fundamental assumptions. Alright guys, thanks very much for watching. Do make sure you watch that video on Prebisch and Singer, that hypothesis, that's going to be quite important as well. But hopefully now you understand how to interpret these improvements or deteriorations in the terms of trade. Thanks for watching, see you all next time.